During a gale force 8 storm in the Baltic Sea, passengers and crew hear a loud metal crash at the front of Estonia's flagship ferry. It's a cold, stormy September night, and the MS Estonia is in perilous conditions. Fast action is needed to stop her from sinking. But the crucial moment to prevent a disaster is missed, and water begins to flood the vessel. The ship quickly fills with more water and rapidly sinks sideways below the waterline. Passengers scramble over each other to escape the outer deck. Few will make it. The MS Estonia was a cruise ferry built in 1980 for the Finnish company Rederi Absali by Meyer Werft in Papenburg, West Germany. During the 1980s and early 90s, it was deployed on ferry routes between Finland and Sweden by various companies. In 1986, a passenger was murdered on board. In 1987, another murder and an attempted murder. In 1993, it was sold to Nordstrom and Tullin for use on S-Line's Tallinn to Stockholm route, the last route it would sail. The MS Estonia was Estonia's largest ship at the time, with the capacity to hold 2,000 passengers. It could also carry freight and up to 460 cars. It had 11 decks with passenger facilities located on decks 1, 4, 5, and 6. The crew had decks 7 and 8, and decks 2 and 3 were for cars and freight. Estonia was a roll-on, roll-off ferry with vehicle access through the bow. The bow was built with an upward opening visor and a retractable car ramp that was positioned inside the visor when it was closed with a watertight seal. At 19:15 on the 27th of September 1994, MS Estonia departs Tallinn, Estonia, bound for Stockholm, Sweden on its regular journey. It's slightly behind schedule, but no one is aware of any problems. It's expected in Stockholm the next morning on schedule. 989 people are on board. 803 are passengers, mainly from Sweden. 186 are crew, mainly Estonian. The actual number may have been even higher. The ship was fully loaded and it's listing just slightly to starboard because of poor cargo distribution. A storm is brewing and the weather is deteriorating. In what will eventually turn into a gale force 8 storm, gusts of wind are strong and the waves are high. There's rain and it's cold. The temperatures are around 10 degrees Celsius. Not that this is necessarily unusual for the Baltic Sea at this time of year. Although it will turn out to be a problem for the MS Estonia, people aren't worried about the weather. All the passenger ferries scheduled to be at sea in the area have set out despite the weather. At first, everything proceeds as planned. It's midnight. The chief mate of the MS Mariella, a nearby ferry, tracks Estonia's speed as approximately 14.2 knots. Another nearby ferry, MS Silja Europa's officers, also estimates its speed between 14 and 15 knots. Some passengers are concerned that it's traveling too fast for the stormy conditions. Some are suffering from seasickness. Others worry about the ship's ability to handle the conditions. MS Estonia proceeds nonetheless. At 0100, the weather is still rough. Wind speeds are 34 to 56 miles per hour. This is equivalent to force 7 to 8 on the Beaufort scale. Wave heights are also still significant, with waves reaching 4 to 6 meters high. At 0110, the Estonia is on the outskirts of the Turku archipelago. Some of the passengers are in the ship's bars and restaurants, or they're at the disco. Others have retired to their cabins because they're tired or seasick. The first sign of trouble is heard when there's a loud bang with an unsettling metallic sound at the ship's bow. The sound is presumed to have been caused by a heavy wave hitting the bow's visor, but it's unclear if the ship's damaged. At this point, the captain on the bridge, Arvo Andersson, still has time to prevent a disaster. If he orders the ship's speed to be reduced, water won't rush in through the front. If he orders a proper inspection of the ship's visor and ramp, he'll discover that it's critically damaged. Instead, the only inspection of the visor and ramp that's carried out is to check the indicator lights that signal the ramp is opening or closing. The check reveals nothing, and the crew assumes everything's fine. The ship maintains its speed at over 14 knots. Over the next 10 minutes, more noises are heard by the ship's passengers and crew at the bow. The locks of the ship's visor have failed under the strain of the storm waves. The visor has separated from the rest of the vessel and pulled the ramp behind it ajar. The visor and ramp are torn off at points that don't trigger an open or unlatched warning on the bridge. The problem doesn't register at the indicator lights. The first metallic bang is most likely the sound of the visor's lower locking mechanism failing. The subsequent noises are from the visor rattling against the ship's hull as it wriggles open and closed while the ship rides through the heavy seas. The ship is dangerously exposed to water flowing in from the bow and no action has been taken. To make things worse, the crew continue to be oblivious as events unfold. Crew on the bridge can't see the visor from their vantage point. There is video monitoring of the inner ramp, but the monitor on the bridge isn't visible from the conning station where the crew are located. The crew can't see as the situation goes from bad to worse. At 01:15, the other locks fail on the visor and it unlocks from the ship completely. As it's torn free, it tears open the loading ramp behind it. Water rushes into the ship, which immediately takes on a heavy starboard list by 15 degrees. The Estonia begins to sink. With the visor and the ramp open to the sea, water floods onto Estonia's vehicle deck. As a roll-on, roll-off ferry, the Estonia is particularly vulnerable to capsizing. This is because having a large amount of water on the wide open vehicle deck will spell disaster. Not just because a vehicle deck can hold a large volume of water. It's also because of what's known as the free surface effect. This is when the swirling motion of water on a large open deck hampers a boat's ability to right itself after rolling with a wave. The Estonia is suffering from this free surface effect and it's rapidly taking on more water. The water levels are rising fast and the ship is listing further. It's sinking beneath the waterline quickly and a desperate scramble for survival starts among the ship's passengers. They have minutes to escape from the ship. As the ship lists, staircases become packed with passengers and difficult to navigate with the ship at such a steep angle. Furniture and equipment fall on the passengers, trapping them in the ship. Walls become floors, making it impossible to tell which way is out. Passengers panic and fight to escape. Some freeze and stay where they are, unsure of what to do. Others are unable to make it through the packed corridors. Many of the crew try to help the passengers escape, forming human chains to pull each other out the steep passageways. Few, however, will eventually make it to the surface. The crew on the bridge begin to try and deal with the situation, but it's already too late. At 01:20, as the scramble for survival escalates aboard the Estonia, the crew finally raise the alarm. Over the ship's public address system, a quiet female voice calls out in Estonian, "Alarm, alarm, there is alarm on the ship." This is followed immediately by an internal alarm for the crew. 1 minute later, the general emergency signal is sounded. At 01:22, the ship's crew attempt to send out a mayday, but they fail to deliver a clear message.
Europa, Estonia. Silja, Europa, Estonia.
Estonia, this is Silja, Europe, replying on channel 16.
A mayday call follows a standard format to establish several key pieces of information. Mayday, the name of the vessel, the location, the nature of the emergency, and the number of people on board.
Estonia, Estonia. Mayday, Mayday.
If all this information is broadcast on channel 16, then all vessels in the vicinity will know exactly how serious the situation is and how to respond.
Estonia, Silja, Europa, are you calling Mayday?
If some of this information is missing, then the response might not be proportionate to the severity of the situation, or it might be delayed while gathering more information.
Estonia, what's going on? Can you reply?
The Estonia directs a call to MS Silja Europa, and only after making contact with their crew does the radio operator on Estonia say the word Mayday. The radio operator on MS Silja Europa, Chief Mate Tayo Sapelin, replies in English, "Estonia, are you calling Mayday?" After that, the voice of Estonia's third mate Andres Tames takes over on the Estonia and the conversation shifts language to Finnish. Third mate Tames says the ship is listing 20 to 30 degrees, but they've lost power and he can't give their position right away. This delays the rescue, and for the 989 people on board, every minute counts. Their standard navigation systems aren't working. The only one that is working is the GPS, which displays the ship's position even in blackout conditions. But that's on the starboard side of the ship's bridge, which is difficult to get to because the ship's listing so severely. Some minutes later, Tames on the Estonia manages to relay their position to Chief Mate Sapelin on the Silja Europa. Either power returns to the bridge or somebody on the bridge, possibly Tames, manages to lower themselves down to the GPS. The Estonia finally radios its position to MS Silja Europa, but there's still key information missing from their emergency broadcast. They've now given their location and mentioned they're listing 20 to 30 degrees. The ships in the area will know that's bad, but Tames hasn't relayed quite how bad the situation is. That there are 989 people on board and that the ship is sinking rapidly. I can imagine Tames is in shock. He'll be fighting his instinct to flee the sinking ship, but he stays at his station. Below deck, things are going from bad to worse. Water is rising inside the ship. After it starts to list, seawater pours through the windows in the passenger cabins and through the massive windows on deck 6. Water flows down through the ceiling panels, stairwells, and down passageways as the ship lists further to starboard. Waves crash over the decks that aren't yet underwater. Water rushes through the lower decks. Passengers fight against the torrents of water rushing through the listing corridors and stairways to get to the outer deck. They struggle against the water and crowds of people in the jammed corridors. People are trapped throughout the ship. More windows give way to the heavy seas. By 0130, the ship has rolled to 60 degrees. Hundreds of passengers are trapped below the waterline. Shortly after 0130, Estonia sends her last radio message in Finnish to say, "Really bad, it's looking really bad right now." At 0150, the Estonia is still alone and it's listing at 90 degrees. Then it slips below the waterline and disappears from the radar screens of the ships in the area. It sinks in international waters about 22 nautical miles from Uto Island off the coast of Finland, settling on the sea floor at a depth of 80 meters. Meanwhile, rescue is still on its way as survivors drift in the icy waters of the Baltic Sea. 1/3 of the people who manage to escape die of hypothermia before rescue even arrives. Survivors cling to the dead bodies of the people in their life rafts, desperate to hold on to the fleeting warmth they provide. Search and rescue operations are being coordinated by the Turku Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. The Baltic is one of the world's busiest shipping areas, with 2,000 vessels at sea at any given time. Rescue plans rely on nearby ferries and boats to provide help. Helicopters can also be dispatched to help search for survivors. This scheme has worked for the relatively small number of sinkings that have occurred in the Baltic before this day. The smaller passenger numbers in previous sinkings may have helped, but the Estonia sinks rapidly and with 989 people on board. To make matters worse, the MS Mariella reports a pan to the Turku Rescue Coordination Center. Where a mayday call is specifically a life-threatening emergency situation that requires immediate action, a pan doesn't reflect the severity of the situation. It's used when a ship needs help and the situation is urgent, but there's no immediate threat to life. As the Estonia sinks, the Turku Rescue Coordination Center still hasn't acknowledged a mayday from Estonia. This is most likely because the Estonia was not very clear with its original mayday call. If they had clearly stated a mayday call that they were sinking with 989 people on board and given their location, then the ships in the area would have immediately understood the severity and scale of the situation. At 0212, the Mariella is the first of 5 ferries to reach the scene of the accident. They assess the situation, and at 0230, a full-scale emergency is finally declared. but the Mariella can't go close to the center of the accident. It's dark and they can't see the waters clearly. If they motor into the epicenter, they risk injuring survivors in their propeller. At 0305, the Mariella winches its open life rafts into the sea. 13 people on Estonia's life rafts are successfully transferred onto the Mariella. These people report the location of other rafts to Mariella's crew, who pass on the message to helicopter crews and other ships that are on their way. 2 Finnish border guard helicopters, Super Puma and Augusta Bell, set about rescuing passengers from the water. During the rescue, these helicopters are forced to land on the decks of the ferries involved in the rescue. The pilot of Super Puma reports that landing on the ferries is difficult and dangerous. Despite that, his helicopter rescues 44 people from the water. MS Isabella saves 16 people with the ship's rescue slide. In total, 137 lives are saved during the rescue operation. Only 94 bodies are recovered from the wreck. In total, 852 lives were lost. The passenger list suggests there may have been 69 more passengers that aren't accounted for. So there may have been even more deaths that night. It's Europe's worst maritime disaster since the Second World War. The sinking of the MS Estonia went on to have a major impact on ferry safety. Just like with the RMS Titanic in 1912, changes were made to general safety and life raft regulations on ferries. Amendments were made to watchkeeping standards. All EPIRBs, or emergency position indicating radio beacons, are now required to deploy automatically. On the Estonia, they had to be manually activated, and this didn't happen. If they'd been activated automatically, it would have been immediately obvious that the ship was in distress and the location would have been clear. New life raft regulations for rescue from listing ships in rough water were also introduced. As with most accidents, the series of events started with a major incident that wasn't immediately recognized. When the first visor lock gave way, only the indicator light was checked. The crew didn't physically check the integrity of the ship. At that point, they could have stopped motoring into the rough weather bow first. If they'd gone astern and reversed into the heavy weather, then water wouldn't have entered the deck and the ship would have remained stable. Having missed that opportunity, the severity and location of the incident wasn't clearly relayed in a mayday call. Then a pan-pan call was relayed from a nearby ship, which only downplays the incident. MS Estonia's third mate, Andres Tamez, who we heard on the mayday call, went down with the sinking ship. Even with a staggering 852 lives lost in Europe's largest ferry disaster, this doesn't come close to the number of lives lost on the Doña Paz. I'll leave a link to that story here.